The land stretched out, 7,000 acres of meticulously managed wealth, a testament to 5 decades of relentless, punishing labor. Every fence line was perfect, every harvest record-breaking. This wasn't just a farm, it was an empire forged by one man's will. Yet at the very peak of this success, standing high above the fields he conquered, the architect of this kingdom felt a terrifying, physical ache. He had mastered the soil, the markets, and the machinery, but he had catastrophically failed at the one thing that mattered most: his own life. The solitude was not peaceful. It was absolute. He woke every night at 3, paralyzed by the realization that all this hard-won wisdom, all this magnificent property, would soon pass to strangers. He had built everything, only to find he had nothing left to lose but the time he had wasted. He traded every potential connection, every chance for love, for the cold comfort of expansion. Now the farm did not need him, but he desperately needed someone, anyone, to share the silence. The terrifying truth was that the king of this land was going to die alone, and the fear of that final empty moment was absolute. The clock on the mantelpiece in the McCormick homestead chimed 3 times, a sound swallowed instantly by the vast, silent house. It was 3 p.m., the hour of absolute reckoning for Silas McCormick, 68. He didn't just wake up, he was thrown into consciousness, his heart hammering against the rigid cage of his ribs like a trapped bird, desperate for air. The paralysis started in his gut, a cold, sickening realization that spread through his limbs, fixing him to the oversized, antique 4-poster bed. The sheets, crisp and white, felt like burial shrouds. He lay there, thick grey hair matted slightly with sweat, his piercing blue eyes wide open, staring into the oppressive blackness of a room designed for 2 but occupied by 1 for nearly 7 decades. This was the curse of the empire. 7,000 acres of meticulously cultivated land outside and inside, a vacuum so powerful it threatened to collapse his very being. The physical ache was back, not the dull throb of an old farming injury, but a hollow, gnawing pain right beneath his sternum, the precise location where a shared life should have resided. 50 years. 50 years he had traded every possible human connection for another acre, another champion bloodline, another record-breaking yield. He had been a ruthless, brilliant general in the war against nature and the market, and he had won everything except peace. He finally forced himself upright, the springs of the mattress groaning in protest, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. He was a man of imposing height, still powerful despite the deep lines etched into his weathered hands and face, lines that mapped out every drought, every successful harvest, and every solitary night. He walked to the window, the thick Persian rug muffling his steps. Outside, the Iron Gate Ranch slept beneath a sliver of moon. The machinery sheds, worth millions, looked like silent metallic beasts guarding the wealth. "The farm needs me," he whispered, the old mantra tasting like ash on his tongue. It was the lie that had built his cage. Now, the farm, automated and efficient, run by systems he himself had implemented, barely registered his presence. It was self-sustaining, a perfect, cold machine, and Silas, the architect, was obsolete. He moved through the vast hallway, past inherited antiques and polished mahogany that reflected his lonely figure. He stopped briefly by a small, dusty table where a stack of yellowed papers sat. The empty invitation stack, wedding announcements, community dinners, church socials, even a few handwritten notes from neighbors inviting him for a simple cup of coffee, all unopened, unacknowledged, dating back to the mid-90s, 1994. That was the approximate time when the personal world of Silas McCormick shrunk to nothing, when the gate slammed shut, leaving him alone with his ambition and the dirt. The shame was a hot flush beneath his skin. He, Silas McCormick, the undisputed king of this agricultural realm, was going to die a virgin. Not just sexually, but fundamentally untouched. He had never shared a moment of genuine vulnerability, never held a hand in the dark, never known the simple comfort of having another soul witness his existence fully. This truth, stark and horrifying, was what truly fueled the 3 a.m. paralysis. He descended the grand staircase, his boots heavy on the polished wood. He headed not for the kitchen, but for his office, a room dominated by a massive mahogany desk and shelves lined with the production records. These ledgers, bound in worn leather, were his sacred texts. He pulled one down, the 2023 volume. Page after page of meticulous data, yields, profits, livestock weights, proof of his professional triumph. He traced a line of figures with a calloused finger. This was the cost. This was the price of a wife, of children, of a life lived outside the boundary lines of his 7,000 acres. The sun was just beginning to streak the horizon in shades of bruised purple and violent orange when Silas finally left the house. He needed the physical reality of his success to buffer the internal terror. He drove his pickup truck, a heavy utilitarian beast, toward the main operations hub. He found Elias Vance, 32, already working. Elias, lean and perpetually sun-tanned, was the antithesis of Silas isolation. He was practical, dedicated, and possessed a quiet reverence for the land that mirrored Silas' own youthful fervor. Elias represented the future, the knowledge Silas had poured into the farm, and the terrifying realization that this knowledge would soon have nowhere to go. "Morning, Mr. McCormick," Elias said, his voice low and respectful, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Elias, check the pressure on the south irrigation line. I don't like the reading I got last night." "Already on it, sir. Had a spike around 4, should be fixed by the time the crew arrives." Silas nodded, a curt gesture of approval. Elias didn't just work here. He understood the farm's heartbeat. He was the unintended apprentice, the son Silas never had the time to conceive. And yet Elias was not family. He was an employee, and the farm deed dictated that when Silas died, the land would pass according to the legal parameters he was now forced to define. Silas watched Elias walk toward a massive John Deere tractor, his movements efficient and confident. The thought struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. When I die, all this hard-won wisdom dies too. Elias might inherit the job, but he wouldn't inherit the story. The 50 years of accumulated intuitive mastery that only a father could pass to a son. Later that morning, the silence of the McCormick homestead was shattered by the sound of a luxury sedan crunching gravel on the long, winding driveway. Evelyn Hayes, 55, emerged. She was a woman of sharp angles and tailored business attire, her cool demeanor a stark contrast to the dusty, lived-in chaos of the farm. She represented the external world, the cold legal reality that Silas could no longer ignore. "Silas," Evelyn greeted him, her voice clipped and professional. She carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the instruments of his final surrender, the will. "Evelyn," Silas replied, leading her into the massive, silent living room where the air felt thick with unused space. She set up her papers on a heavy antique table, avoiding eye contact with the trophies and ribbons that lined the walls. Testaments to the champion bull and his lineage, symbols of fertility and success that mocked Silas' own barren existence. "We need to finalize the disposition of the Iron Gate Ranch," Evelyn began, her tone devoid of emotion. "As we discussed, without direct heirs, the options are limited. A trust, a foundation, or the sale to a major conglomerate. Given the sheer size, 7,000 acres, and the complexity of the operation, a quick transfer is essential to maintain its value." Silas leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I built this from 800 acres, Evelyn. I didn't build it for some distant foundation or some faceless corporation to break up and sell off piecemeal. I built it to last, and it will last, Silas. But you won't. You must face the reality that you made choices that eliminated the possibility of a blood successor. The wisdom you've accumulated, the rotational grazing patterns, the specific hybrid feed mixes, the market timing, that is knowledge, not property. And knowledge, unless transferred personally, is lost to the grave." The word grave hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. This was the heart of the terror, the inciting incident that forced him to move, the drafting the will event. He was being forced to articulate the destination of his life's work, and every option pointed to the same agonizing conclusion: strangers would inherit his legacy. "What about Elias?" Silas asked, the name coming out reluctantly, a desperate last-minute plea. Evelyn raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Elias Vance is an exceptional foreman, He could manage the operation for a trust, certainly, but he is not family. He does not inherit the deed. He does not hold the weight of 50 years of sacrifice. He knows the land better than anyone but me, Silas insisted, ignoring the legal truth. Knowing the land and owning the land are two different things, Silas. Legally, we need a clean beneficiary. We need to prevent this estate from being tied up in litigation for years. If you don't name someone specific, the state will decide, and I guarantee you that outcome will be far worse than any option I'm presenting. Silas pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly across the floor. He needed air. He needed to see the land, his land, to feel the tangible proof of his mastery. "Give me until tomorrow," he commanded, his voice rough. "I need to think." Evelyn, ever professional, simply packed her briefcase. "The clock is ticking, Silas. You spent 50 years expanding your borders. Now you have only days to define them." After she left, Silas drove straight out to the farthest reaches of the property, not stopping until he reached the Grand Silo. It was the tallest structure on the Iron Gate Ranch, a colossal cylinder of steel and concrete, reaching high into the bright midday sky. He climbed the external metal staircase, the rhythmic clang of his boots against the steel echoing his solitary heartbeat. From the observation platform at the top, the 7,000 acres spread out like a magnificent detailed map. Fields of corn and soybeans stretched to the horizon, intersected by perfectly maintained fence lines. Below him, in a specially fenced pasture, grazed the champion bull, a massive muscular animal, the pinnacle of his breeding program. The bull represented potency, success, and the continuation of a bloodline. Silas leaned against the railing, his blue eyes scanning the vastness. He remembered 1974, the year he took over the initial 800 acres. He was 23, bursting with energy, driven by a singular, consuming idea to prove he was worthy of the McCormick name by making this farm an empire. That initial commitment had demanded everything. He had consciously chosen the soil over the soul. He closed his eyes, recalling the few times he had almost faltered. There was Sarah, a girl from Harmony Creek, the small town he had long since abandoned. She had invited him to a dance in '85. He'd told her, "The farm needs me." He remembered the look of hurt confusion in her eyes. That was the last time he had allowed himself to consider a life outside the borders. The physical ache returned, sharper now, fueled by the memory of the life he had actively rejected. He had built this empire, brick by solitary brick, only to realize he was the king of nothing but dirt and steel. He looked down at the champion bull. The animal was surrounded by his herd, fulfilling his purpose, ensuring the continuation of his line. Silas was genetically potent, physically capable, yet personally sterile. He had mastered breeding livestock, but had failed to breed a life for himself. The irony was a bitter poison. He pulled the farm deed from his jacket pocket. The thick parchment felt cold and heavy. This was the physical representation of his legacy, the document that would soon transfer his 50 years of mastery to the hands of strangers. The realization hit him with a sudden, devastating clarity, the climax of his internal struggle. The fear of death was not the worst part. The worst part was the fear that his entire existence, his entire struggle, would be rendered meaningless the moment his heart stopped beating. The knowledge he had fought so hard to acquire, the complex, intuitive language of the land, would vanish without a trace, leaving only the cold, hard assets for others to divide. He had prioritized the preservation of the farm over the preservation of his own story. He gripped the deed so tightly the paper crinkled. It was too late. He was 68. The time for courtship, for marriage, for raising a family was long past. He had wasted his life, and the terrifying truth was absolute. He was going to die alone here, high above the empire he had built, a monument to his own catastrophic priorities. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping around the silo, feeling the immense weight of his success and the crushing burden of his failure. He was trapped between the magnificent view of his accomplishment and the terrifying vacuum of his future. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the 7,000 acres, shadows that seemed to stretch out and swallow him whole. He descended the silo, his movements slow, deliberate. He knew what he had to do next, even if the thought was agonizing. He had to decide which stranger would inherit his world, or whether he could somehow, in the few years he had left, find a way to transfer the intangible wisdom, the 50 years of mastery, to Elias Vance, the only person who seemed to genuinely care about the land as much as he did. But even that felt like a desperate, impossible gamble against the cold, hard truth of the farm deed and the years he had irrevocably lost. He stepped into his truck, the engine roaring to life, drowning out the silent scream of his solitude. He drove back toward the silent, opulent house, knowing that tonight, 3:00 a.m. would come again, and the terror would be waiting. The truck engine died, leaving a vacuum of silence that the old Victorian house seemed eager to absorb. Silas stepped out onto the gravel drive, the sound of his boots echoing disproportionately in the vast, quiet expanse of the Iron Gate Ranch. The homestead was massive, a monument to inherited wealth and 50 years of relentless labor, yet it felt colder than the winter air outside. Every window was a dark, vacant eye staring back at the man who had traded warmth for acreage. He walked past the porch swing that had never swung with a shared moment, through the heavy oak door, and into the oppressive silence. He didn't turn on the main lights. The faint glow from the kitchen provided enough illumination to navigate the familiar, dusty hallways. His destination was the library, a room lined with leather-bound books he'd never read, filled instead with the documents that truly defined his life. He pulled open the heavy safe, the tumblers clicking a rhythm that was the only consistent music of his adulthood. Inside, stacked neatly, were the production records. He didn't need to look at them. He knew the figures by heart, the yield increases, the lineage charts of the champion bull, the profit margins that had swelled year after year, transforming 800 acres into 7,000. He ran a weathered hand over the smooth, thick paper of the top ledger. This was the gospel of Silas McCormick, the proof that he had not wasted his professional life. But right next to the meticulous ledgers lay a small, brittle stack of envelopes, tied with a faded ribbon. The empty invitation stack. These were the ghosts of the life he had murdered. Invitations to the annual Harmony Creek Founders' Day picnic, the church social in '97, the wedding of a distant cousin, a New Year's Eve gala from 2005. Each one bore the same handwritten note on the back, scrawled in his own hand, "The farm needs me." He picked up the oldest invitation, the paper yellowed and fragile. It was for a simple community dinner, dated 1994, the approximate year his personal world had officially ceased to exist. He remembered sitting at this very desk that evening, the smell of fresh-turned earth clinging to his clothes, feeling a smug sense of superiority that he was too vital, too necessary to waste time on trivialities like socializing. He had believed he was sacrificing fleeting pleasure for eternal legacy. Now, holding the brittle paper, he realized he had merely traded substance for shadow. The ache in his chest intensified, a searing reminder that while the records detailed a triumph, the invitations catalogued a catastrophic failure. He shoved the invitations back into the safe, the sound of the heavy door closing a final, definitive period on that chapter of regret. He needed to focus on the future, or what little of it remained. He needed Evelyn. The next morning, Evelyn arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. She drove a pristine black sedan, a stark contrast to the mud-splattered utility vehicles that dominated the ranch. She was all sharp angles and tailored wool, an emissary from the world of law and consequence, a world Silas had largely ignored until now. They met in the library. Evelyn spread her documents across the polished mahogany table, her movements precise and efficient. Silas sat across from her, feeling suddenly clumsy and large, his working clothes smelling faintly of feed and diesel. The smell of his success, the scent of his solitude. "Silas," Evelyn began, her voice cool and professional, "I've reviewed the current trust structure. It's ironclad regarding asset protection, which is excellent. However, you've been vague on the succession plan for the operating entity itself. Who inherits the business?" Silas leaned forward, resting his heavy, weathered hands on the table. "I told you I want the farm to continue. I want the knowledge to continue. I don't want some corporate outfit buying it up and stripping the soil." Evelyn nodded slowly, but her eyes held a hint of impatience. Legally, Silas, we deal with assets and ownership. Knowledge is intangible. If you don't designate a direct heir, the land, the equipment, and the livestock, all 7,000 acres, will pass to the closest living relatives, however distant, or be sold to satisfy estate taxes and distributed. If those relatives are strangers to farming, they will sell it, likely to a corporate outfit. That is the legal reality. The word strangers hit him like a physical blow, exactly as it had at the silo. He had built this empire to last forever. Yet the law, the very framework he had trusted, was poised to hand his life's work to people who wouldn't know a champion bull from a common feeder. "What about Elias?" Silas asked, the name coming out hesitantly, almost a question to himself. Evelyn flipped a page. "Elias Vance, your foreman? He has no familial claim, nor is he currently named in any document. You could, of course, bequeath the entire estate to him, but the tax implications would be astronomical, likely forcing him to sell immediately just to pay the government. Or you could set up a specific operating trust, but that requires transferring not just the land, but the wisdom, the 50 years of mastery you possess. Does Elias have that mastery?" Silas looked away, toward the window overlooking the vast green fields. Elias was good, dedicated, technically proficient, but he didn't possess the intuitive language of the land that Silas had spent a lifetime acquiring. The instinct for weather changes, the deep understanding of cattle lineage, the knowledge of which fence post needed replacing before it even showed signs of rot. That wisdom was in Silas's bones, and it couldn't be transferred via a legal document. "I need time," Silas mumbled. "Time is precisely what we don't have, Silas," Evelyn stated, her tone softening marginally, shifting from professional to cautionary. "The truth is, you've put off this personal planning for decades while expanding the farm exponentially. Now the farm is a behemoth, and the legal cleanup is equally massive. We need a decision on the operating successor by the end of the month, or we risk complications that guarantee the sale to a third party." Evelyn packed her briefcase, her detachment serving as a mirror reflecting Silas' own emotional coldness back at him. She was the consequence of his priority system, efficient, successful, and utterly lacking in human warmth. After Evelyn left, the silence of the homestead seemed to press in on Silas, heavier than ever. He couldn't shake the image of Elias standing alone, trying to manage 7,000 acres while simultaneously battling the IRS. It was an unfair burden. He decided he had to talk to Elias, not about the will, not yet, but about the knowledge. Silas found Elias in the main machinery shed, meticulously calibrating the latest $1 million combine. The shed was clean, organized, a testament to Elias's dedication. The air smelled of clean oil and metal. "Elias," Silas said, his voice rougher than intended. Elias straightened immediately, wiping his hands on a rag. "Silas, everything all right?" "Fine. Just checking on the new calibration specs." Silas walked slowly past the massive piece of equipment, trying to find the right words. He felt like a teenager trying to ask someone to a dance, awkward, vulnerable, and completely out of practice. 50 years of speaking only the language of profit and production had left him mute in the face of human connection. "The specs are tight," Elias confirmed, pointing to a digital readout. "Well, increase efficiency by another 0.5% this season. Easily." "Good." Silas paused. He wanted to say, "I need you to absorb everything I know. I need you to be my legacy." Instead, he pointed to a section of the combine's header. "You check the lateral flow on the auger. That specific angle is critical in wet years. I learned that the hard way back in '88. Lost half a field because of a lazy calibration." Elias listened intently, nodding and taking notes. "I'll double-check it, Silas." "Thank you." Silas felt a wave of frustration. He was trying to transmit 50 years of hard-won wisdom, the very soul of the farm, and it was coming out as a technical checklist item. "It's not just the calibration, Elias," Silas pressed, trying a different angle. "It's the feel. Do you know why we rotate the ryegrass specifically on the North 40, even though the soil analysis suggests corn?" Elias thought for a moment. "To manage nematode populations and reduce fertilizer dependency?" "Partly," Silas admitted, disappointed. But mostly it's because the runoff from Harmony Creek carries a specific mineral deposit that interacts poorly with corn roots in that particular clay composition, leading to a subtle, unseen stress on the plant during peak summer heat. I figured that out after 3 years of marginal yields and thousands of dollars wasted on soil testing that missed the obvious. It's about knowing the land, Elias, not just reading the reports. Elias' eyes widened slightly, acknowledging the depth of the knowledge, but he remained respectful and reserved. I see, Silas. He'll make a note of the clay composition interaction. That's something the books don't teach. The books don't teach, Silas thought bitterly. Only 50 years of solitude teaches that. He realized the immense, impossible gulf between them. Elias was dedicated, but he was 32. He was just beginning his journey. Silas needed a lifetime of shared experience to transfer his knowledge, and he had perhaps 5 years left. He had wasted the 40 years required for true mentorship. He left the shed, the sound of Elias' efficient work continuing behind him, feeling the failure of connection acutely. Elias was the closest thing he had to a son, a successor, and yet Silas couldn't even manage a genuine conversation that wasn't rooted in technical specifications. That night, the terror returned with brutal force. The clock radio glowed 3 a.m. Silas woke instantly, not from a dream, but from the sudden, absolute silence of the house. He was lying flat on his back, eyes wide open, staring into the impenetrable darkness of his bedroom. The paralysis was immediate and total. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the realization that he was utterly, profoundly alone in the face of it. There was no gentle hand to reach for, no familiar breathing beside him, no distant sound of children stirring in the next room. There was only the sound of his own frantic heart hammering against his ribs, a desperate drumbeat counting down the remaining moments of his solitary existence. He tried to move his arm, to reach for the bedside lamp, but his muscles refused to obey. He was trapped in his own body, a prisoner of the bed, while his mind raced through the catalogue of his failures. He saw the face of the woman he'd ignored for the dance in '85, the stack of untouched invitations, the cold, professional gaze of Evelyn discussing the fate of his life's work with legal indifference. The fear was so intense it manifested physically. His chest tightened, not just the familiar ache of regret, but a sharp, clinical pain. Was this it? Was this the final, solitary moment? He gasped, fighting for air, the panic rising like bile in his throat. He finally managed a violent lurch, throwing himself upright, scrambling off the bed. He stumbled through the dark, not knowing where he was going, only knowing he had to escape the suffocating silence of that room. He ended up in the trophy room, a long, narrow space dedicated to the farm's achievements. Silver cups, blue ribbons, framed photos of prize-winning livestock, including the champion bull, immortalized in glossy print. He fumbled for the light switch, bathing the room in harsh, cold light. He stood in the center, surrounded by the physical evidence of his 50 years of unparalleled success. But in the 3 a.m. terror, the trophies didn't feel like achievements. They felt like mocking monuments to his misplaced devotion. Each polished surface reflected a distorted image of a terrified, aging man who had won the world but lost his soul. He saw the framed production records hanging on the wall, a stylized graphic representation of the farm's growth curve. He walked up to it, his breathing ragged, and slammed his fist against the glass, the impact rattling the frame but not breaking the protective barrier. He wanted to shatter the proof of his triumph, to erase the evidence of the priorities that had damned him. He backed away, clutching his chest, the realization hitting him with the force of a revelation. The farm hadn't needed him. He had used the farm as an excuse. The mantra, "The farm needs me," was the most elaborate, self-serving lie he had ever told. He had been terrified of connection, terrified of vulnerability, and he had hidden behind the immense, demanding structure of the Iron Gate Ranch. The farm was his shield, and now, in his final years, it had become his cage. He sank onto a nearby antique bench, his head in his hands, the cold silver trophies gleaming around him. He was a king in a golden cage, and the only thing waiting for him was the certainty of dying alone, his knowledge scattered, his legacy reduced to line items on a balance sheet for strangers to squabble over. The terror was absolute, but now it was tinged with a profound, self-inflicted guilt. The next morning, exhaustion was etched into every line of Silas' face. He was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee when his satellite phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Silas, I need to confirm the meeting with the estate planning specialists. They require a preliminary decision on the disposition of the livestock trust by Friday, specifically the champion bull." Silas felt a wave of nausea. The champion bull, the pinnacle of his breeding program. "What about him?" Silas asked, his voice hollow. "Well, if there's no designated successor who can manage the genetics, the specialists recommend liquidating the high-value assets immediately to simplify the estate and mitigate future tax liabilities. That means selling the champion bull and the top breeding cows at auction. They represent significant capital. The idea of selling the champion bull, the animal that embodied 50 years of careful, meticulous genetic work, to be dispersed among corporate buyers, felt like tearing a piece of his own flesh. It wasn't just capital. It was the culmination of his life's mastery. "No," Silas said, the word a gravelly whisper. "Absolutely not. That bloodline stays intact. Then you must designate a successor capable of maintaining that integrity, Silas. And quickly. Otherwise, the law dictates the most financially prudent course of action for the estate, regardless of your emotional attachment to the livestock or the land." Evelyn's voice was relentless, the cold voice of the external world closing in. Silas gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was trapped. If he designated Elias, he risked bankrupting the young man with taxes. If he designated a trust, the law would force the liquidation of the very assets he treasured most, reducing his sacred knowledge to cold, divisible cash. He looked out the window. Elias was already out in the distant pasture checking the herd, dedicated, earnest, and completely unaware that he was the last fragile hope for Silas's intangible legacy. Silas knew he had to act, but the path forward was murky, fraught with legal and emotional risks. He was a man who had mastered the earth, but was now utterly defeated by the simple, complex reality of human connection and mortality. He realized, with crushing finality, that the only thing harder than building an empire in solitude was trying to save its soul when the solitude finally broke him. The clock was ticking, not just on his life, but on the very existence of his 50 years of hard-won wisdom. He hung up the phone, the silence of the massive house returning, no longer a comfort but a terrifying echo chamber of his regret. He was going to have to risk everything to try and transfer the untransferable, or watch the strangers dismantle his life, piece by agonizing piece. The silence of the McCormick homestead was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating, like dust that had settled for 50 years. Silas walked through the grand echoing rooms, his footsteps muffled by thick inherited rugs. He stopped in the library, a room he rarely used, preferring the stark utility of the farm office. Here, among the leather-bound volumes he had never opened, sat the objects of his obsession and his ruin. He pulled the massive leather-bound production records from the safe. Decades of meticulous entries, charting the precise yield of every field, the lineage of every cow, the profit margins that defied national averages. He ran a weathered finger down the column for 1994, the year his personal world had officially ceased to exist. In that year, the yield was spectacular, a record breaker. Simultaneously, he had turned down 3 separate invitations: a town dance, a church picnic, and a neighbor's retirement party. The empty invitation stack, yellowed and brittle, sat on a nearby mahogany table, a cruel monument to his catastrophic priorities. These records were not just data, they were the ghost portraits of the life he had murdered. Every successful harvest represented a missed opportunity for connection. Every prize-winning animal a conversation he hadn't had, a hand he hadn't held. The triumph of Irongate Ranch was the tragedy of Silas McCormick. He picked up the farm deed, the paper crackling under his touch. 7,000 acres, a kingdom built on sweat and sacrifice, now a liability he couldn't control from the grave. Evelyn's words echoed. The law dictates the most financially prudent course of action for the estate, regardless of your emotional attachment. Prudent. The word tasted like ash, liquidation, strangers. The champion bull reduced to a commodity. Silas knew the legal risks of designating Elias as his heir were immense. The inheritance tax alone could crush a young man, forcing him to sell off parts of the farm, undoing the expansion Silas had dedicated his life to. But the alternative, allowing the wisdom, the specific, nuanced knowledge of this soil and this bloodline to vanish, was a spiritual death sentence. It was the ultimate final proof that his life had been a profound waste. He needed to transfer the intangible. Not the acres, not the millions, but the soul of the operation. And he had to do it now, before Evelyn and her estate specialists could put the auction gavel down on his legacy. He found Elias in the machine shed, meticulously calibrating the massive combine, a piece of equipment worth more than most homes in Harmony Creek. Elias didn't look up immediately, his concentration absolute. He possessed the quiet, focused dedication that Silas recognized, the same fire that had consumed his own youth. But Elias was different. He had a fiancée in town, a life he was building alongside the farm. He hadn't yet been consumed by the earth. "Vance," Silas said, his voice unusually rough, "leave that. Meet me at the silo. Now." Elias looked up, surprise flickering across his sun-tanned face. Silas rarely summoned anyone to the grand silo, the tallest structure on the property, the place where he went to feel the dizzying height of his success and the crushing depth of his isolation. The ascent up the narrow steel staircase of the grand silo was grueling for Silas. Every step was a reminder of his 68 years, his lungs burning with the effort. When they finally reached the observation deck, the wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dry hay and distant manure. From this vantage point, the 7,000 acres stretched out in a breathtaking panorama of green and gold, a perfectly organized, colossal geometry of human mastery. The McCormick homestead looked like a child's toy house below. Elias stood respectfully a few feet away, waiting. Silas didn't look at the farm. He looked at Elias. 50 years, Silas began, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. I stood right here, maybe 1,000 times. Every time I saw this empire, and I thought, Silas, you did it. You are the king. But I was wrong, Vance. I wasn't the king. I was the jailer. I built the cage myself. Elias remained silent, sensing the monumental weight of the moment. Silas turned, finally facing the vast expanse, his blue eyes piercing, yet full of an ancient sorrow. You see that boundary line 5 miles west? The one where the irrigation stops? That's where the 800 acres ended. Everything beyond that I built. I sacrificed everything to make this land whole. I sacrificed me. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. This was the confession, the terrifying truth he had guarded for decades, the secret that mocked his success. I told myself, the farm needs me. It was a lie, a convenient, self-serving lie. The farm only ever needed good management. What I needed was a life, a wife, kids, someone to share a meal with that wasn't a hired hand, someone to argue with about the weather, someone to grow old with. Silas clenched his fists, the weathered skin tight over the bone. I am 68 years old, Elias. I built an empire, and I am going to die a fool, a rich, powerful fool. Do you know what the most humiliating truth is? The one that wakes me up at 3 in the morning, paralyzed by terror. I am a man who commands thousands of acres and millions in assets, and I am still a virgin. I never learned how to love anyone but this dirt. I wasted my life. The admission hung in the air, raw and shocking. Elias shifted, a flicker of genuine pity and discomfort crossing his face. Mr. McCormick, Don't pity me, Vance, just listen. That knowledge, the knowledge that built this, it's not in the ledgers. It's in my head. It's in the way I look at the champion bull and know exactly which feed ratio will optimize his genetic expression. It's in knowing where the water table shifts in a drought. That wisdom is the only thing of value I truly possess, and if I die without passing it on, it dies with me. And then, the lawyers, the strangers, they win. They dismantle the soul of Iron Gate Ranch. Silas stepped closer, his imposing height magnified by the urgency in his eyes. Evelyn is forcing my hand. She wants to liquidate the champion bull and the bloodline by Friday, to simplify the estate. To them, it's just capital. To me, it's 50 years of my life's work. To save it, I have to designate a successor who can maintain that integrity, someone who understands the difference between profit and legacy. He placed a heavy hand on Elias' shoulder. I am going to put you in the will, Elias. Not as an employee, but as the designated heir to the livestock trust and the operational management of this ranch. You will inherit the knowledge, the mandate, and eventually the land. But you need to understand the cost. Silas pulled a folded legal document from his pocket, a preliminary draft of the will amendment. The tax burden, Vance, will be staggering. It will force you into debt immediately. You will have to fight the IRS, fight Evelyn, and fight the sheer weight of this place. You will have to dedicate the next 20 years of your life to servicing this inheritance. It's a poisoned crown, Elias. It will demand everything from you, just as it demanded everything from me. Silas looked away, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I am asking you to risk your future, your peace, maybe even your marriage to save my past. I am asking you to accept the very burden that ruined my life, just so my knowledge doesn't vanish. I have no right to ask this. Elias looked down at the sprawling, wealthy land, then back at the broken, powerful man before him. He saw the terror in Silas' eyes, a terror far greater than any financial fear. He saw a man begging for his life's meaning, not to be erased. McCormick, Elias said, his voice steady. I grew up on this land. I know what you built. I know the difference between the balance sheet and the bloodline. I know the value of the champion bull is more than market price. He paused, absorbing the enormity of the commitment. I won't lie, the risk is terrifying. But you taught me everything I know. You taught me how to read the clouds, how to feel the soil, how to breed excellence. That knowledge, it deserves to live. It deserves to be used. Elias met Silas's gaze, a profound seriousness settling on his young face. I accept the burden, Mr. McCormick. I will fight the lawyers. I will fight the taxes. I will keep Irongate Ranch whole, and I will maintain the integrity of that bloodline. But you have to teach me everything you haven't told me yet. Every secret, every nuance. And you have to trust me to do it my way, too. I won't let this place take my life like it took yours. I will run the farm, but I will still go to town. I will still marry my fiancée. I will not become a prisoner. Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Not the physical ache of regret, but a sharp, clean relief. Elias wasn't just accepting the land. He was accepting the lesson. He was promising to preserve the legacy without repeating the mistake. Good, Silas managed, his throat tight. He nodded toward the papers. Then we call Evelyn. We set the mechanism in motion. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, phone calls, and intense, compressed learning. Silas, energized by the purpose of the transfer, became a demanding, relentless mentor. He didn't just hand Elias the production records, he walked him through the specific decisions behind the numbers. They spent an entire afternoon in the massive shed, housing the champion bull. Silas didn't talk about genetics or feeding schedules. He talked about intuition. Look at his eyes, Vance, Silas instructed, pointing to the massive, placid animal. See the intelligence there, the quiet power. You can chart everything on paper, but if you don't recognize the spirit of the animal, you're just a glorified accountant. That's the wisdom that dies with me if you don't internalize it. Elias absorbed it all, asking sharp, insightful questions that proved he wasn't just listening, he was integrating. Evelyn, cool and professional as ever, finalized the legal designation. She warned Silas again of the immense risk to Elias, the complexity of the tax mitigation strategies, and the potential for years of litigation. You are making this unnecessarily difficult, Silas, Evelyn stated flatly over the phone. I am making it right, Evelyn, Silas retorted, feeling a strength he hadn't known since 1994. The farm's soul is not negotiable. The Friday deadline passed. The champion bull remained in his stall. The bloodline was secure, tied irrevocably to Elias Vance. Weeks turned into months. The summer heat settled over Irongate Ranch. Silas continued his routine, waking before dawn, but the paralyzing fear of 3 a.m. had begun to recede. It hadn't vanished. The regret was too deep for that, but it was no longer absolute. Now when he woke, the terror was often replaced by a flicker of purpose, a thought of what he needed to show Elias that day. He had started eating dinner at the homestead's massive kitchen table, not alone, but with Elias, often joined by Elias' fiancée, who brought a lightness and laughter the old house hadn't heard in half a century. Silas was awkward, stiff, and often silent, but he was present. He was learning slowly and painfully how to share space with other human beings. One evening, Elias' fiancée placed a small, simple birthday cake in front of Silas. It wasn't his birthday, but she said, "Just because." Silas stared at the small frosted confection, the single flickering candle casting shadows on the dusty antiques. He hadn't received a personal, unsolicited gift in decades. He felt a sting behind his eyes, a sensation so foreign he almost dismissed it as indigestion. He realized the transfer of knowledge wasn't just about farming. Elias, by accepting the burden and refusing the isolation, was unintentionally teaching Silas how to be human again in the very last moments of his life. It was late autumn. The harvest was complete, another record-breaking year secured by the systems Silas had built and the tireless work Elias had executed. Silas found himself back at the grand silo, but this time he was alone. The sun was setting, painting the 7,000 acres in hues of deep orange and purple. He looked out over the empire, no longer seeing a cage, but a bridge built of dirt and steel, connecting his wasted past to Elias' promising future. He thought of the empty invitation stack still sitting in the library. He had wasted his life. That truth remained immutable, a scar he would carry to his grave. He would die alone. He had ensured that long ago. There would be no wife, no children, no tender hand holding his in the final moments. But he would not die a fool. He had finally desperately invested in the one thing he had always neglected: a person. He had transferred the intangible, the wisdom that mattered more than the acreage. He closed his eyes, feeling the cold wind on his face. The physical ache in his chest was still there, the profound sadness of a life lived incorrectly. But beneath the ache there was a quiet, profound certainty. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw Elias in the distance, driving the truck toward the machine shed, his silhouette framed against the dying light. Elias stopped, climbed out, and looked up toward the silo. He couldn't see Silas, but he paused as if sensing his presence. Then, Elias raised a hand in a simple, respectful salute before disappearing into the shed. Silas raised his own hand in return, a gesture swallowed by the vast empty sky. He turned from the view of the empire and began the slow, deliberate descent down the narrow stairs. He was tired, profoundly old, and deeply regretful. But he was no longer terrified. He walked back toward the silent Victorian farmhouse, the massive structure that had been his opulent, dusty tomb. He knew the end was near. He might die tonight or next year. But when he did, the knowledge would not die with him. The strangers would inherit the balance sheet, but Elias Vance would inherit the soul. Silas McCormick walked into the homestead, the massive door closing behind him, silencing the wind and the world. He did not look back at the fields. He had finally looked forward, into the future he had secured for someone else. He sat down in his favorite armchair, the one facing the empty fireplace, and waited for the night. The house was still silent, but for the first time in 50 years, Silas wasn't listening for the echo of his own solitude. He was listening for the sound of the future, the distant hum of the machinery that Elias would start at dawn. The fear was gone. Only the quiet, devastating truth remained. A life wasted, but a legacy saved in the final hour. Don't let this history be isolated. Like and subscribe to build our legacy.